In 2001, one of the greatest horror games ever made released, kicking and screaming its way into a video game industry currently shifting between the 5th and 6th generations. Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare is the product of multiple conflicting factors. It is the 4th game in the first survival horror franchise, but its gameplay style reflects Resident Evil's more so than its own, putting it in this strange place of being pulled between its franchise roots and survival horror trends of the time period. Considering the overproliferation of tank control games at the time, it's not surprising The New Nightmare landed on average in the 6 to 7 out of 10 range from most outlets. It's a 7 out of 10 game back during a time when 7 out of 10 games were still worth playing. With several decades of games to play, it's just hard to justify playing a 7 out of 10 title nowadays. There were also less games released each year back then, so a good game was still awesome to pick up and play. This was supposed to be the start of a reboot trilogy, so these impressions really hurt this franchise, as the planned sequels for this title would end up being scrapped, leading to the 2008 Alone in the Dark and Illuminations in 2015. And well, let's just not talk about those games since they essentially murdered the franchise. Actually, forgetting about them entirely would be preferable.
Sorry.
If you look at Metacritic, you'll even see some of these old reviews, like this one from Electronic Gaming Monthly where they said, illogical puzzles, vague directions, and objects almost impossible to spot against the backgrounds cause you to waste too much time wandering the same rooms over and over again. And low ratings like this, during a bygone era of gaming, is what gave The New Nightmare the bad rap it once had. And no one tell the reviewer from Adrenaline Vault who said, the release stands alone as the darkest disappointment those of us who cherish this franchise have yet encountered. About the later titles in this franchise, I don't think this guy or gal will be able to survive the disappointment. As the title of this video suggests, I don't agree with these reviewers, and I would go so far as to say The New Nightmare is one of the best classic survival horror experiences ever made.
Why would you say something so controversial yet so brave?
I've got a lot of reasons why I think this, and in this video, I'll break down my reasoning based on The New Nightmare's use of light mechanics, Aline and Carnby's campaigns, occult themes, and place in the horror canon. You're watching Rayl Deal Games, and I release weekly gaming videos every single Friday. If you like this video, consider subscribing after smashing that like button. I'm super stoked to share my thoughts on one of my favorite horror games ever made with all of you today. With all that established, let's dive right in. Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare released in 2001, a whole 23 years ago at the time of this review. Even the technical theory of ray tracing didn't exist yet, but somehow The New Nightmare does an excellent job mimicking light's behavior with its light switch and flashlight mechanics. So get this, The New Nightmare is a fairly dark game, and the way you find things in the environment is by alighting it with rays from your flashlight. I've played loads of survival horror games from this era, and none of them attempted to try this type of disparity between light and dark. Even Fatal Frame from 2001, while it does innovate upon the survival horror formula, doesn't play with shadows in the same way Alone in the Dark does. Despite how scary the dogs jumping through the windows are in Resident Evil Director's Cut, The New Nightmare has its own moments that are as fear-inducing. For example, there's this moment where the player, as Aline, comes across a cabinet that is banging. At the time, the player is probably expecting a jump scare, but Alone in the Dark anticipates this expectation, so when the player opens the cabinet, they see nothing. As soon as they exit that screen though, they are ambushed by 2 shadow dogs. This part legitimately made me jump to the same degree Director's Cut's dogs did when I first triggered that scene over 20 years ago now. And in this same room, there's this mirror puzzle where the player has to shoot the mirror to reveal a sought-after puzzle piece. Once this happens, the lights in the room drop immediately, spawning enemies into the room. And these types of encounters are unique to Alone in the Dark, as it plays into the theming of horror based on that disparity of light and dark. The Photosaurus enemy type even jumps away from the player when they flash them with light, which is one of the most unique behaviors for a monster in a survival horror game. They are even killed immediately if the player hits a light switch, drowning their darkness in light, returning once more when darkness dominates the dank, crowded space of the room the player is in. Another great example of this disparity between light and dark is when the shadow zombies show up in a flash of lightning's wake. These are subtle jump scares that program the player to be tense, and when this happens the first time in the Aline campaign, the zombies just disappear. whereas later they stay when the light from the lightning fades to darkness. This is a super smart utilization of the light mechanics in Alone in the Dark, and the way the developers played with light and players' expectations just sets this game apart from others in the same era of gaming. Now, providing the player with the ability to move their flashlight at a whim didn't always translate to perfect controls. Dual analog sticks were fairly new still by the release of Alone in the Dark, and many developers weren't sure yet how to use both in their games. From a modern player's perspective, it seems obvious that the movement of the character should be the left stick and the flashlight control should be the right, but this is not how it works in Alone in the Dark. There's no option to turn on analog support, which is probably because the developers and gamers didn't know how useful analog sticks would be for most gaming genres. Really, fighting games and 2D platformers are the only genres that don't necessarily love an analog stick, and since those were the most common gaming genres in the 90s, it makes a lot of sense that dual analog controls were slow to catch on at first. This does put the flashlight in an awkward control position. It would have been nice if the left analog moved the character and the right analog moved the flashlight, but instead the D-pad moves the character and the left analog stick moves the flashlight, making it super awkward to control. You can't control the flashlight and move at the same time anyway, beyond looking directly down with it, so I guess it all works out in the end. And light is not the only thing the new Nightmare does to separate itself from the rest of the survival horror genre, as it comes with two separate campaigns that, unlike Leon and Claire in 1998's Resident Evil 2, are incredibly unique from one another. Let's start with Aline's campaign. So when I play 1998's or 2019's Resident Evil 2, I always start with Claire's campaign because it always feels like the right way to approach that game. For Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, I decided to go with Aline first because I know her campaign is focused on puzzles and horror, whereas Carnby's is more combat heavy. Something The New Nightmare has over Resident Evil 2 is the way each character starts in vastly different locations, and this change in environment really makes their campaigns feel different. I love horror, and something you don't get on subsequent playthroughs of survival horror games is that sense of terror from the first run. I love to make sure I get as much horror as possible on my first playthrough, which is one of the many reasons I play horror games guideless as well. I love games from this era because there's a nice blend of gameplay, seriousness, and humor all mixed together. And the best early example of this is the description of the stove in this game. Clicking on the stove in the attic gifts the player the genius "even this stove seems to regret being here" description. From here, the player is stuck in the attic with an old lady and a bunch of photosauruses, and with a flimsy flashlight as her only defense, Aline has to escape. Getting used to the controls and figuring out the layout of the upper attic is incredibly enjoyable, but I'd be lying if I said everything about Alone in the Dark is perfect beyond this point. This game has this big problem of respawning enemies. In survival horror games, respawning enemies is a major issue because of limited ammo and healing items, and the backtracking core to the genre's identity. And I'm pretty sure the developers know they made a mistake by making enemies infinitely respawn, as they will consistently teleport you back to Lucy Morton, the old lady and mother of the two Morton brothers that function as the primary antagonists of this game, instead of making you walk back each time after major story moments, like when you find major puzzle pieces or complete a significant boss fight. This is a little baffling, as the developers could have just made enemies not respawn like in the original Resident Evil, and I'm not sure why they didn't do this. Now, one of the critiques of this game that I don't think is entirely valid is the puzzle design. I was able to figure out every puzzle in this game on my own, and while it did take some gray matter grinding at times, I didn't find anything illogical like the Electronic Gaming Monthly reviewer from the top of this video said. I actually really liked a lot of the puzzles in this game, like trying to figure out where to backtrack for specific puzzle pieces, such as the projector's prism. Most of the time, every puzzle solution can be found by exploring the manor more extensively and by taking notes. Yeah, this is a game from the era where taking handwritten notes is a good idea, and it is possible that the EGM guy just didn't do that well. There's also this boss fight in the fort part of this game, where Aline has to use lightning to kill Howard Morton, the father of the two Morton brothers. Alan Morton, one of the brothers, infused him with the essence of the dark world, causing him to turn into this super creepy monster. After a shocking smackdown, Aline has to race this 2-minute timer through the entire fort level in order to power this lightning Canon in the basement or underground catacomb area, opening up her path into the ritual chamber / research lab beneath Shadow Island. Aline's later sections are not entirely finished. There's several points where it felt clunky at best to get through, especially her final encounter with the Obed Morton mutant amalgam. I actually had to redo the ending because the trophy for beating the final boss with her is actually missable. You can just run right past him by stunning him at the right time, which is what I did because I couldn't seem to damage him with the weapons I tried. It was actually only because of the T-Rex from Dino Crisis that I was able to figure this out. There's a section in Dino Crisis where you essentially have to stun the T-Rex long enough to escape, and I figured this guy was the same. The way he moved his two heads made it seem like I had to hit one over the other, so I targeted the big head first, and lo and behold, that was the right one. There was also this one point where I just ran outside the bounds of the level while trying to exit this swampy underground area near the end, which was kind of weird. But when I play games retrospectively, especially short games like this, I can look past these little foibles because in cases like this, it's not enough to ruin the whole experience. And after possibly perpetuating patricide, Carnby's crucible begins. Instead of landing on the roof of Morton's manor like Aline, Carnby lands in the forest surrounding the estate. This creates unique combat situations for Carnby as he is exposed to the zombies and dogs far earlier than Aline. Taking the incorrect path, the player is jump scared by 3 zombies that appear and disappear in a flash of lightning. Soon afterward, Carnby meets a man missing an arm in this dark, tomb-like structure. Leaving this room results in this man becoming minced to mush, with only a few bullets ringing out in his defense. Getting into the manor is much more difficult for Carnby as he has to run from shadow dogs and ophthalmicids, which are like these really tanky, fast, and aggressive little buggers. And instead of getting into the manor through the front door, Carnby's got to get in through the water tank. While in here, a Phocomelis, or crocodile-like monster, will ambush Carnby, and when I was younger, this guy would kill me all the time. But he's actually not that hard to kill. Just waiting for him to jump up and spinning around real quick to empty a load of hot lead into his face a few times is enough to obliterate him. From here, Carnby's process through Morton's manor is a little more open than Aline's, as he gets a few possible paths to take fairly early on. This fact makes me feel justified in playing through Aline's side first, as doing so provides the player with enough map knowledge to know how to navigate the manor with Carnby more efficiently. After exiting the manor, Carnby's secondary location is a swamp and secret laboratory, which is extremely different from Aline's old fort secondary location. This further diverts this game from the typical RE approach to multiple campaigns, and shows just how ambitious the new Nightmare really is. It's just a shame some of the rougher sections weren't sanded off, because I would have loved to see the rest of this trilogy and where this team would have taken the survival horror genre. Carnby's slink through the swamp is honestly one of my favorite parts of this game, because there's a nice amount of tension creeping through this area when zombies are around every corner. We also get to see the plane from the opener here, and I love seeing that come full circle. There's this cool cutscene of the plane sinking into the swamp right after this too, and the poor pilot drowns on screen as well. That guy definitely didn't deserve that, and I know they explain it in game, but Carnby could have absolutely saved this guy.
But he died a hero.
He died for murder, you dumb fuck.
Something I didn't talk about too much in the Aline section is the Shadow World itself, and the only thing I've got to say about this place is how it is interesting how the player is given essentially infinite ammo and a high-powered lightning-throwing pistol to run and gun through this final area. Aline's path through here is a bit more complicated with more puzzles, but you'll be able to see from the footage here essentially everything you need to know about this area. Carnby's final boss differs from Aline's quite a bit. Alan Morton is a shadow ghoul, much like his great-grandfather before him, and it is up to Carnby to strike him down with a holy spear of light. Gameplay-wise, this shows up in a few ways, as Alan Morton is completely invulnerable to damage.
Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left. Yes, I have. Look! It's just a flesh wound.
The only way to kill him is to find this side path in the boss arena holding the hidden spear. The first time going down this path just results in Carnby being bodied by Alan, but after getting up, a few casual blasts to Alan's head will down him, giving Carnby the opportunity to get the spear and kill Alan in a cutscene. Alone in the Dark may not have great bosses, but it does have great vibes between its environments and tone, and its occult themes really contributes to this. Beyond Fatal Frame, which released the same year, the occult wasn't really covered in survival horror before Alone in the Dark. There was Clock Tower on the SNES, but things more in line with Resident Evil were far more common. Alone in the Dark, while focusing on its conflict of light and dark, centers this conflict on occult magic and shamanistic rituals. In Aline's campaign, one of her early bosses is Dekerto, this ghostly figure residing in mirrors. He asks you to get a special magic mirror for him, and he never comes across as trustworthy during this entire process with him. Giving him the mirror results in Aline's death, but destroying the mirror banishes him. This type of magical entity is extremely different from a lot of enemies in horror video games, and I appreciate this game a lot for this. Edenshaw, the final warrior of light, is a consistent character between the two campaigns, and he is the last surviving member of the Abkhani tribe, a society of Native Americans who once resided within the Shadow World, protecting the Earth and humanity from its influence. He tasks both Aline and Carnby to find magical totems for his ritual to close the Shadow World off from Earth, and I really like this way of resolving the conflict over the typical survival horror approach of either killing the final big bad or destroying the horror from orbit, like the nuking of Raccoon City in Resident Evil.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
The Shadow World is still around, and this adds to the horror of this game because the main conflict of the new nightmare can happen again via another portal, and I'm sure this is where the other titles in the trilogy would have gone given the chance. There's just this melding of science and magic in the main Morton antagonists of this game, and this mashing of monstrous forces solidifies the new nightmare's place in the survival horror canon. Early on in this playthrough of the new nightmare, I was quickly reminded of the early era of video game voice acting in this game. However, unlike some of the contemporary reviews of this game, I don't think all of the voice acting in this game is bad. Carnby and Aline's voice actors aren't top of the line by any means, but I don't think they're awful. The rest of the voice actors are definitely comparable to the Resident Evil games of this same time period. Metal Gear Solid really revolutionized the expectations critics had for voice acting in video games at this time, and I think the new Nightmare did face undue criticism that other games at the time weren't being raked over the coals for. It doesn't help that Final Fantasy X came out 2 months after the new Nightmare, and Metal Gear Solid 2: The Sons of Liberty was slated to release 5 months after as well. FFX and MGS2 are proper next-gen experiences, whereas Alone in the Dark was decidedly a 5th-gen PS1 era game. If the new Nightmare came out just a year earlier, I do think the review cycle for this game would have been more kind. And that's really where Alone in the Dark places now in the horror canon. It's a game that holds a lot of promise, but it was quickly overshadowed by next-gen titles that were just doing much more exciting things at the time. I love this game, but even I would say Fatal Frame is better, and it would drop in December of 2001. The very same year of the new Nightmare's release. Even Code Veronica, which came out the year previous, is better overall, and the Resident Evil remake of 2002 blows all of these horror games out of the water. Alone in the Dark is an awesome horror game that unfortunately got sandwiched every which way by more ambitious and better games. There may be a bunch of better survival horror games out there, but I would still place this in my top 50 of the genre. And with that, let's answer the final question of each of my reviews. Will this game make my top 100 of the 2000s? I've not played the 2024 Alone in the Dark game yet, but out of every other game in the series, this is my favorite entry in the Alone in the Dark franchise, and I recommend it to every survival horror fan out there. I'm happy this title is now available on PS5, because it's nice to see more people experience it, and it has a platinum to boot. Adding that plat to my collection is a nice thing I'll always be thankful the port exists for. So yes, the new Nightmare will be making my top 100 of the 2000s, as it has been on there ever since I first started making the list all the way back in 2018. It's in the blue category, which means it might leave at some point as I play more and more games from this decade. But there is a possibility I'll be talking about this game again whenever I finally finalize and publish that list. And that's the video, my guys. What do you think of Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare? Let me know all about it in the comment section below, and while you're there, please smash that like button and subscribe. I make new Rayl Deal Gaming videos every single Friday, and hitting the notification bell is the only way away to make sure you don't miss out on my future creations. Next week, I'll be sharing my top 10 gaming franchises of all time. This video is going to be super sick, and you definitely won't want to miss it. Regardless of what you choose to do, thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games. Have an awesome day, my gamers.